Welcome to Coffee and Conversation, a production of Empower Mississippi, where we believe every Mississippian can rise if we remove barriers to opportunity. I'm Grant Callen, founder and president, and today we're talking with my friend Pauline Rogers. Pauline has been a tremendous ally in the fight for criminal justice reform legislation in Mississippi, and her day job, she's the president of RECH Foundation, which stands for Reaching and Educating for Community Hope. Pauline, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Grant. Glad to be here.
Well, let's kick things off this way. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your organization, RECH Foundation?
RECH Foundation, like you said, reaching and educating for community hope. We are a ministry to help individuals and families impacted by crime and incarceration, with the goal of seeing a thriving and sustainable community inclusive of those impacted by crime and incarceration.
And where are you located?
We are in Jackson, Mississippi.
Good. So
South Jackson, to be exact.
Oh, good. Tell me about how your story, your personal story, inspired you to start this organization.
I was inspired. I'm a church girl. And so my inspiration came from the church, where we were always taught, do unto others as you would that others would do unto you. And so having lived with that philosophy, I landed in prison. I witnessed my father be killed at the hands of my mother through self-defense. I got stuck in that place of trauma. My shoplifting was, if you're in my household, if you got the last cup of milk, last cookie, last piece of chicken, whatever, without consent, that was stealing because you didn't ask for it. And so my grandmother always taught me, who was a devout Christian and Sunday school teacher, it was my responsibility to help with my younger siblings. So I had 10 younger siblings. And so I took that literally. And I would go steal to help provide. Well, that stealing, I couldn't keep that up. And so to help keep food on the table, I would look through the local penny pincher, thrifty nickel, which is the popular papers when I was growing up, free papers. And I would scan them for the nearest funeral and dress up my siblings, not to go grieve with bereaved families, but to get to the repast. And 40 years ago, you could go to a repast and easily leave with a whole casserole, a whole pan of bread, whole pot of rice, pot of beans, etc. And I would take that food home and bless it. It was deceptive, but it kept my family together. It kept us fed. Spiraling down, I ended up with a 6-year sentence and was sent to the Mississippi Department of Correction and did half of the sentence that I was sentenced to. I did 3 years on a 6-year sentence.
So you went to prison for shoplifting and
Yes.
served a couple of years in prison, and it was a transformative situation because my understanding is you came to know the Lord in prison. Is that right?
I did. Well, I actually was in the county jail. And they had volunteers that came to the county jail. And I met a volunteer at the county jail who prayed for my feet, prayed for me. When she first started coming, I was slammed the door. I thought I knew everything there was to know about church because I grew up in the church. So what could you tell me about the church? Well, I knew church, but I didn't have a relationship with Christ. And that was the transformative part. One day when I was broken, that volunteer didn't have to ask me to come to service. I was in there. She prayed for me. Fast forwarding, when I actually got to prison as a Christian, that same volunteer I ran into again, and my life just kept going up from that point. I knew about a relationship and how to walk through a relationship with Christ.
How did you get from your release and reentry to the point where you could start this organization? Were you involved in prison ministry right after your time of coming out of prison?
I was involved in prison ministry on the inside, Grant. And what I mean by that, I was selected. When you go to prison, you have to meet the classification board, where they evaluate your intellect, your IQ, your technical skills, whatever education to place you in prison. When I went to prison, that was the process. And so, but you weren't inhibited from going to the religious services. So I went to the religious services. I was a church girl. So that was easy. And now I had this relationship where I wanted to be there. It wasn't make you go. I wanted to be there. I longed to be there. So I got selected by the chaplain, the first female chaplain that was hired by the Mississippi Department of Corrections. Wendy Hatcher picked me out of all the women that were there to work for her. And I modeled what I thought she was bestowing upon me. Example, when you went to prison, you were identified by your number. I was 66743. Everywhere you went in the prison, you had to call out your number. Well, when Miss Hatcher doing services, that's how I identified myself. And she said, "What is your name?" Well, when she did that, it penetrated a stony place that I didn't even know was developing on the inside of me. When she asked me my name, I became human again, because she asked me more than one time, because I had said my number more than one time before she came back to the question, "What is your name?" And from that, she started the mentoring process, and that's how I got involved with that. Well, it didn't get stuck there. We had to have religious services in the prison, in the dining room, on these metal benches, and you always had to yield the right of way for the next building to come and eat. And I heard Miss Hatcher say that she had built a chapel before in Parchment. And I said, "Well, we can do it here." And she said, "Well, honey, that's the whole process. You have to write a proposal, et cetera, et cetera." And I said, "Well, we can do it. If you did it, we can do it again." So we did it in the chapel that's actually at Central Mississippi Correctional Facility. I was the lead inmate in working with Miss Hatcher on that project, where the governor, I don't remember if it was William Winter or Bill Elaine, who was the governor at the time, granted us permission to travel across the state, giving testimonies. And every time somebody gave us an offering, we saved the money to get the chapel built. And after we got it built, we couldn't have the services. And so a wealthy guy in the city put the security fence around there, and we had it the chapel. So there, in essence, was one of the things that launched me into doing the ministry and wanting to do it. They had another volunteer who made sure that prisoners had toiletry items. And that same lady, different lady, Joyce Horton, groomed me to take on this job that she was doing in the Presbyterian church. So she took me around traveling with her to these various churches, and I took what was bestowed upon me and put it in a little model of what I thought how I perceived what was done to me, and heard about women who were still in prison because they didn't have housing, and started the mindset and ideas of, I'm going to produce a house, name it after Wendy Hatcher, and got out and started it.
So your organization, what are some of the day-to-day things that you do to come along those families who have experienced incarceration?
The first thing is the gospel. And the primary thing for me is the gospel, Grant. And the reason it is the gospel, I'm all for higher educational programs, technical programs, etc. But I have learned over the years that if there is not a change of the heart, you can educate, train a person all day long. What you will end up with when they leave prison, an educated center, an adjusted center if they're meeting with a psychologist, or trained center if they're going through a technical program, they're going to leave a trained center, and yet no real change. So I do believe in the programming, rehabilitative program, but you have got to have the Christian piece there, not to shove in people's throat. You introduce it and you model it. And so what I've tried to do is introduce it and model it. Telling people that been to prison, that's why, I'm all for ending mass incarceration, but I'm not an abolitionist that say, let's open up the door and everybody go free. I do believe in alternative and reimagine programming, but there are some people that have been incarcerated, that they were born to commit crime. So I think we have to look at all phases of it. So that's what we do, go inside the gospel primary, telling them how they can live with making an honest wage. It may not be the wage you want, but if it's honest and you're making it, you have to do it and ask for an advocate. Don't be afraid to reach out to somebody when you're struggling. So we do all of that.
When you look at the numbers, 95% of those that are currently behind bars will one day be let out.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that at least, some significant percentage don't have anybody on the outside. And when they come out, they don't know where to go. And they don't have relationships for family or people they can lean on. So as they come out, is that where people that are coming out of prison can connect with your organization?
Yes, they can connect, both men and women. We have transitional housing for women. We have, over the 30-something years, we have a 27-acre reentry campus. Now, it's not all developed yet, but transitional housing. The first person that we transitioned was in 1989. She stayed 3 years, off and on 3 years. And so with that housing, it didn't start from a formal place of living. It started from me having an extra room, and she needed somewhere, and I had lived with her, and I knew the barriers that I faced when I got out. The church that I so longed for in prison, when I got out of prison, were not there. And when I left prison, there were 17 other people that wanted to be in whatever church I went to. Well, we went to this church, all 17 of us. And now that we were there at one time, but all of us didn't get out at the same time. When I got out, they wanted to come to the church where I was. Well, when I got to the church, there was a parole officer there that made an announcement that she was a parole officer and she believed in sending you back if you violated. Well, 12 of those people immediately left and never came back. So it's a part of everybody having to be educated in dealing with the reentry and reintegration of a person. We have to be, for lack of words, ex-offender friendly, if you will, in order to be able to help people thrive and maintain and sustain in society.
So for someone who has served their time and is coming back out into the real world, you mentioned barriers. What are the greatest barriers, at least in Mississippi, that make it hard to rebuild your life?
Housing. You can't even leave prison without first having housing if you're being released on parole. Oh, if you flat time, you may not have anywhere. If you flat time, they have to let you out. Flat timing meaning you're leaving without being on any probation or parole or supervised supervision. So housing is a number one barrier. And then you got the box on the application that asks you if you were formerly incarcerated, even if you were renting, you can get rejected because of that box. Even if the box isn't their grant and they decide to do a background check, it's the same thing. A background check and the box is the same thing for a formerly incarcerated person. If that record comes up, it kicks you out. You are ineligible for housing. And the other barrier is transportation and lack of a job. Now, I do know and understand people when they say when you get out of prison, you should have a job. When people first get out of prison, having a job is not the first thing for all of them. If you ever had any experience, the lived experience of incarceration, you need mental health services first before a job. Because you can get to that job, and if your mental health state and you haven't gone through some type of healing, declassification, if you will, you won't know how to deal with an employer, and that employer, vice versa, won't know how to deal with you because there is trauma that is experienced by every single person that goes behind the prison wall. Even if you never get sent to a building, if you go through that classification, receiving process of prison, that's another whole process. That process alone, without ever having slept on one night bed in a prison, is traumatizing. Every cavity of your body is searched. And what's not a cavity, your eyelid is almost flipped inside out. Your eyes are pulled down. So they are searching you. And depending on the nature of the person that's searching you, Grant, it can be traumatizing within itself, because some of these people need to be incarcerated like the person that they're searching, because they come with issues. And we can see even in some of the corrections where you got officials uh, committing crimes. So it's serious when you come out of prison. There's a serious need, in my opinion, before employment, that they go through a mental health process first.
It seems like for many people, the reason they got behind bars in the first place was because of an addiction issue or a mental illness issue. And that's not to say that we don't hold people accountable for what they do, but in a lot of cases, incarceration ought to be a last resort instead of a first resort. And,
Yes.
I'm encouraged by the movement towards drug courts and intervention programs and ways to, on the front end, keep somebody out of the prison system who really is not a threat to society.
Right.
So it just makes sense to me that if some of the people are there because of their mental health or addiction issues, there's sort of this misnomer that if we send people to prison, well, if it's an addiction, they'll at least dry out, sober up, and be ready to re-enter when they come out. And that is just a misunderstanding of the way prisons work, in that a lot of times there's more readily available contraband and illegal substances in prison than there are out. And if you're not getting the help you need, you're not going to come out more ready to be a good citizen. You're going to come out a lot worse.
More ready to be a different kind of criminal. More ready to think that you got the criminal system beat. More ready to think you know how to go in and rob, steal, or kill a more excellent way. And there's really no such thing as doing crime in a more excellent way. But that's why I despise juveniles being sent to prison. And no matter how horrific the crime, you cannot couple these kids in the same environment and think you're going to get a different result. They are going in and coming out worse than. So we need pre-intervention programs, programs where you get sentenced to versus incarceration. And they don't necessarily have to be a program. Send them to go cut all of whatever field, to work off the time. And if they survive that, you survive it. It's the punitive part has got to be revisited in the state of Mississippi.
You mentioned earlier that there are some people that absolutely need to be in prison that are dangerous, who are just inclined to commit crimes. Mm-hmm. But there's such a dehumanizing approach in many of our prisons that doesn't prepare people for life. How do we balance the need to protect society from truly dangerous people with needing to have a system that in some ways is rehabilitative and helps people get back on their feet? How do we balance those two things?
You got to have everybody at the table, as uncomfortable as it may be. I've been both a victim and I've been the perpetrator. I've been them both. I've been hit across my head, robbed. I've been both. But you have to have people. The governor has to listen to people like me. But how do people like me get to the table? I am all for having clean, safe communities. I'm all for having people teach people how you live in a community, not park on your grass, how to keep your house clean, how to keep your lawn clean. And it's that simple. Oh, where I live, I am an immaculate housekeeper. And I demand that of the people that we house. And we set the bar, we set the boundary. And when you have people at the table that can help show you or work with you, I'm not anti what the governor does. We just, everything that he does or she would do, but you gotta have people at the table to say, because some people that the parole board would release, we have disagreed with. Those of us that have been formerly incarcerated disagree with. But because they were free and they let somebody out, we didn't have a voice, nobody asked. Because we live with the people, so our perspective and what we know, see, or hear may be different than what you're reading on a piece of paper by way of how many RVRs or no RVRs at all, and know them differently to say, you missed it on this one. They're not ready yet.
Well, so let me close with this question. What would you tell lawmakers about what you would encourage them to do differently with our criminal justice system?
Look at those of us like myself, 30-something years, never reoffended, not been back to prison. In 32 years, we have zero recidivism and most of them have been violent offenders, let me say that. The longest serving person that we've dealt with did 38 calendar years, never reoffended, still free. The next one, and they've been male and female, 34-year sentences, 20, these large number, and they've been Black, white, Hispanic. We have a Hispanic guy that did almost 30 years. Not 1 year in the 30 years has he ever missed driving from Hattiesburg to come help us serve children of prisoners every year, other than last year. He got sick, was diagnosed with cancer. So you have to pay attention to those stories. And to me, if you want to look better, use your successes to make your state look and be better. Take ownership. If you take ownership of my wrong, grab hold and take ownership of some of my right. But you can't take the whatever for my right and not be responsible for some of the wrong. You can't have it both ways. So I think they should embrace those of us who are doing it and have us at the table with advocates like you and Empower Mississippi, who are a foundation for those of us going forward that help us, do what we do, be who we are.
If we have a recidivism problem, which we do, it makes sense to me that we ought to reach out to those who have been successful, who have served time and went on to lead a great, rewarding, productive life as great citizens and who are now giving back. We absolutely ought to hear from you about how you did it and how do we do it for other people. And I appreciate the work your organization is doing. And that's a really impressive track record to say nobody that's gone through your program has gone back into prison. That's a great track record, and I'm grateful for your work.
Well, I'm grateful for your work, and it's advocates like Empower Mississippi that I had, that my husband had, who was formerly incarcerated. He went to jail at the age of 14, went to Parchment at 15, got out when he was 31. We've been married come December 30 years. Mm-hmm. And so you have to, I'm in Mississippi. I haven't lived anywhere else, so Mississippi should take ownership in that. This is our Mississippian. This is, and not just think that all of the successes live outside of Mississippi. If you got successes in Mississippi, take ownership of them, rebuild who we are, and restate the narrative of what's going on and what's happening in Mississippi.
Thank you for what you do. Thank you for joining us for this conversation, and thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you.